We are back on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio News Talk 1180. Our guest by phone, June McCash, talking about her new book, A Titanic Love Story, the story of Ida and Isidor Straus, the co-owners of Macy's.
Now, did they start Macy's or did they buy Macy's? How'd that all come about?
They bought Macy's. R.H. Macy was the founder of the company, and after his death, it went through several owners, which were his relatives. But eventually, one of the owners asked the Strausses if they would be interested in buying a half or the whole of Macy's. They chose to buy a half, and eventually he didn't want to stay in the business, and they acquired the other half as well. But they had a concession in the basement of the store for quite some time, and it had been one of the most successful parts of the store, if not the most successful part. And they were very much beloved of the employees, and so it was a very good match for them. It was Isidor and his brother Nathan who became the owners of Macy's.
And were they
and eventually Isidor's sons would become the sole owners after his death.
Now, who was responsible for the major growth of Macy's over the years?
The major growth of Macy's?
Yes.
Well, Isidor was the man on the ground, if you will. He was the person who handled most of the business. So I would like to say it was Isidor, but Nathan, too, had an important role. He was the outside man who was a charismatic character who brought in lots of business. And so I think it was a combination of the two. They both had very different talents as merchants, and they had learned well from their father, Lazarus Straus, who had been a very successful merchant as well. He had owned L. Strauss, and it became L. Strauss and Sons, which was also a well-known store in New York. And they also owned Abraham and Straus. They came into that buying a share as partners with Abraham.
Mm-hmm. Wow. How long did the Strausses own this company before they took the trip on the Titanic?
Well, quite a number of years. They came into Macy's around the turn of the century and had been owners of Macy's for quite some time. I mean, they'd become very comfortable in their store, and now Isidor's sons, two of his sons at least, were already very active in the management of the store. So he felt for the first time in his life a little more liberty to take time away from the store. And he and Ida were spending the winter in the south of France, which they frequently traveled abroad and to Europe in particular and spent many winters there.
Mm-hmm. June, was the movie Titanic faithful to the Strausses?
No, not at all. It's my understanding that there was an actual scene of their efforts to get them into the lifeboat filmed, but that it was not included in the film.
You know, I read that too. It was on the cutting room floor.
Cameron tried to allude to them with that elderly couple dying in bed, which some people may recall, but that is not at all what happened, and that is not the Strausses in my view.
Now, if I remember right, and I did read that also, that it ended up on the cutting room floor, but is it true that she actually had one foot in the lifeboat, looked up at him and said, "I can't leave you"?
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. She got out of the lifeboat and took off her fur coat and gave it to her maid and gave up her seat in the lifeboat to her maid, Ellen Bird. Ellen was saved, of course, and she was offered a second seat in lifeboat number 4. And again, they tried literally to drag her into the boat, and she simply refused to get in. She felt safer in the arms of her husband than she did on a lifeboat in a dark, open sea.
I mean, what a romantic story. I mean, that really is it's the kind of story you really can't make up, and it's just
you really can't. And it was definitely a love match between the two of them. And as I can tell through their letters, it grew more passionate through the years. The longer they were married, I think the more they loved one another. Even when Isidor was in Congress, he wrote to Ida at least once a day, and sometimes several times a day, to keep her involved in his life. And she was very much involved in every aspect of his life. He would sometimes bring home people like the Secretary of State and give her a day or two's notice. She never complained. She enjoyed it too, and she was a very intelligent woman who participated participated in the wonderful discussions that went on around their dinner table.
We are visiting with June McCash, author of A Titanic Love Story, the story of Ida and Isidor Strauss. So, what I understand is people actually saw them sitting in deck chairs, holding hands on the deck of the Titanic as the wave was rushing over them. Well,
there was a story that by the time the waves actually rose, that they were standing beside the rail watching the others sail away, and they were holding each other in their arms. I think that is very probable. They did for a time sit in the deck chairs and watch as the lifeboats were loaded, but I think by the time the ship actually went down, they were standing and watching the others. Isidor's body was eventually found. They were all wearing life jackets, although Ida had temporarily taken hers off to give her fur coat to her maid. Whether she ever put it on again, I'm not certain. But she was standing there being held by her husband, and she had a very weak heart, and it's my guess that Ida died fairly quickly from the cold of the water and the sudden shock. Isidor apparently did not. He was on the surface floating, and when they found his body, they never found her body, and the two were memorialized together in Woodlawn Cemetery with a cenotaph, which has the shape of a boat, a sort of Egyptian boat that used to carry the dead souls, I presume, to the other world. And Isidor is actually buried there, but it's also a memorial to Ida.
How old were these people when they died?
Well, people thought of them as elderly at the time, but actually Ida was 64 and Isidor was 67. So by my standards today, they seem fairly young.
I guess that depends on where you're looking at it.
It's all relative. Well, and I think today, the early 60s and mid-60s is not really that old.
I totally agree with you, June.
Today's 60 is yesterday's 40 is what they say.
I like that.
Yes, absolutely. I like it too.
Yeah. It's another sidebar to this is there are so many stories that night, and America's elite, I felt, handled themselves well. I mean, you had John Astor, who could have got on the boat and didn't, Benjamin Guggenheim. So you've got so many famous American people that had the influence and yet decided to do the honorable thing and literally not get on the boat when they could have.
Well, actually, John J. Astor did request permission to go with his wife, his young wife, who was pregnant at the time, and Officer Lightoller, who was boarding the boats on that port side, because this was the same vessel that Ida was offered a seat in, said no, he couldn't go. So he did request a seat, but he didn't insist. And, these, of course, were extremely wealthy and powerful men and could have, I suspect, used their power more than they did. But there was honor among those men in first class. I don't know. There were only 4 women who died in first class, and each one of those has a wonderful story. Ida's, I think, being the most remarkable, but one woman refused to leave, allegedly, because she wouldn't leave her Great Dane behind. Another woman gave up her seat to a younger woman with several children, and the fourth one was looking for her baby, who had already boarded a lifeboat with the nurse, but she wouldn't get on the boat until she found her baby, and so she and her little girl died together.
And I understand there is a memorial to the two of them in Macy's in Manhattan when you walk in the door.
There is a memorial in Macy's. There is also something called Straus Park on the Upper West Side of New York, and it's actually located within sight of where their family home was. It's an amazing little park. It's a kind of respite from the busyness of that area, and I would encourage anyone who goes to New York to visit Straus Park.
June, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The book is A Titanic Life Story, and we will see you in 167 hours on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio, News Talk 1180.